Okay, so thanks again. So my main research program involves investigating how people adapt their reaching movements in response to altered visual feedback of the hand. And this type of visuomotor learning, also known as adaptation, is widely used to investigate and model learning processes that are likely incorporated by other types of motor learning, including skill acquisition, but in a more reasonable time frame. And so I assume many of you might not be familiar with the paradigm. So let me give you the basic task. So we have people reach to a target, shown here, with a cursor that represents their otherwise hidden hand. And what we do is we manipulate the cursor so that, in this case, it veers to the right of where the hand actually moves. And people are usually very good at adapting to this. That is, after a few trials or so, they learn to compensate for this misalignment of the cursor, sometimes known as a cursor rotation or visuomotor rotation, and veer their hand to the left in order to get the cursor onto the target. And now, if this manipulation of the cursor is small or gradually introduced, people usually are unaware that they're being given false visual feedback, they're actually changing their direction, their movement. But even so, whether they're aware and they know exactly what's going on, or they're not aware of what's this manipulation, people, after some practice, will continue to misreach, at least for a few more trials, even when the cursor is no longer visible. So when they're asked to reach the target without any visual feedback of their hand, they continue to deviate their hand movements. That is, they produce reach after effects. Okay, and I'll discuss a little bit about what these look like a little bit later on in my talk. But the question here is, well, we're interested in the learning mechanisms involved in adaptation, but specifically I become interested in how different senses and different inputs interact and how they underlie or are affected by adaptation. So, because most studies and models of motor learning have focused mainly on the changes in motor performance, without really exploring the implications of how this changes our estimation of our sensory estimations of our hand position. And in fact, while most models do suggest that adaptation is associated with an update into the predicted consequences of movement, which I'll explain in a moment, they usually assume there's only a unified estimate of hand position. So my research question here is really looking at the implications of adaptation on sensory estimation and prediction. So I'm going to try to show this using really a simple model of motor control, which begins with a goal, produces a motor command, which gets sent to the muscles to produce some movement. And of course, we get feedback about this movement. Now it changes the environment, mostly proprioception and vision, but this is not the only input that we have. The brain also makes a copy of the motor command, sometimes known as an efference copy, and sometimes I'll call it efference signal. And this copy is sent to various brain areas to produce the necessary forward model computations to produce a predicted estimate or predicted sensory consequences. So we have two pieces of information. We have the feedback that we get from our senses are somewhat delayed and can be noisy, as well as the more predictive aspect or predictive estimate of the hand location. And this information gets combined to update our belief about the state of the world. And this can be used to modify the ongoing movement or produce modifications for subsequent movements. So I'm particularly interested in limits contribute to motor control, contribute to learning, and how they get changed with learning. Okay, so, but it's very difficult, as you can see from that previous model or diagram, they seem to be largely independent, but they're hard to disentangle. It's hard to really look at changes in prediction and changes in perception, because when we provide altered visual feedback on the hand, not only are we introducing a dissociation between proprioception and vision, we're also introducing dissociation between prediction and vision, right? Every time we produce a movement, not only do we get these predictive estimates, we're always going to have proprioception. We can't get rid of it. It's not like we can just turn off the lights and get rid of vision. Proprioception is always with us. So we're trying to understand these two different contributions requires a little bit more of a task where we can hopefully isolate it. But before I show how we do that, let me just give you also some background information. So research from my lab and others has shown that training with altered visual feedback of the hand leads to a robust consistent changes in hand proprioception. But so what we're interested in, though, today in this talk is how to measure changes that also must be occurring for these feed-forward predicted consequences. And to do that, we're actually use a task that was used by Reza Shadmir and Izawa about almost 10 years ago, where they asked people to estimate the location of a hand. We've been doing that in my lab for a long time. But what they did is they had people actively generate a hand displacement. Okay, so again, this is always in the context of adapting to a cursor rotation, but they would include some trials at the end where they had people actively move their unseen, always unseen when these localization tasks, unseen hand out and back, and then use their seen left hand to indicate where their hand had been. Okay, and in my lab, we call these active localization because the movement is self-generated, and therefore it should have this kind of predictive estimate as well as the proprioception, which we can never get rid of. And then we accompany this with trials where we do what we call a passive version, the same thing that we've been doing in my lab for over a decade now, where the robot drags the hand out. In fact, in this paradigm, the robot moved the hand to the same locations that people produced in the previous block where they're doing these active self-generated movements. And so in this case, any prediction should be minimal, given that they're not volitional movements, they're just getting their hand dragged out. And of course, what we're interested in seeing is how training with this altered visual feedback, the hand affects these estimates. So if we see changes in active localization, they should reflect an update in the prediction, as well as recalibration proprioception. But in the passive localization, we should only see any changes should only reflect the recalibrated proprioception. And of course, we're only looking at changes because we collect also these estimates prior to training. So we have a baseline estimate and we're looking at changes. Okay, so before I show you our main result from this task of this study, is just a typical learning curve. So I'm showing you the first 20 trials and the last 20 trials when they get this 30-degree cursor rotation. And you can see by the end of the 90 trials that they're compensating almost fully. They should move their hand 30 degrees where the dashed line is. So this is a typical learning curve. It's pretty good. They're quite quick and they compensate almost completely. But again, we're really interested in seeing how the change in estimate hand position. And that's what I'm going to show here. First, I'm going to show you for the active localization, which again has prediction as well as proprioception. And again, this is relative to a baseline measure that we take prior to training. And that's shown here. So we can see that people have a consistent shift in their estimate of hand location, about 9 degrees towards where they experience the visual feedback during training. Of course, this task, they don't see the hand. So this is the amount of change. But we see almost a similar size change in the passive condition. Here it's only 6 degrees, and that's very consistent with my previous studies as well, showing when we estimate location of the hand in multiple ways. But we can see for the most part, it's a little bit smaller, but almost the same size. And for reasons I don't really have time to explain here, although we can discuss it later, we think these changes are largely additive. So this suggests that at least 60% of the change in the in the active version of this task really is reflecting proprioception, is reflecting what we see in the passive task. So let me give you a demo what this actually looks like. So what we're doing is we're asking people who can't see their hand, right? So this is their hand, it's hidden, and they just learned to move the hand with this displaced or altered visual feedback that's shifted, in this case, to the right. And then after they get sufficiently trained, we then ask them, where do they think their hand is, right? Where do they think their hand was in its case? And what they do is they take their left hand and they indicate where they think their unseen trained hand was. And you can see, I'm trying to draw here that they misperceive their hand as being a little bit toward where they visually experienced the hand during training. So it's about 20%, that's kind of the passive when it's proprioception only. But when they self-generate the hand displacement for these trials, again, with the hand hidden, they actually indicate where the hand is even more towards where they visually experienced their hand during training. Okay, so hopefully that's clear, because the base of my next more studies is based on this kind of measure. Okay, and I can't tell if there's questions. I don't know if I'm supposed to look. Hopefully you can let me know. So in summary for this first study, adapting reaches to altered visual feedback of the hand leads to shifts in estimating the unseen hand, and these shifts in hand localization may reflect changes in proprioception. And what we've seen in this study and in previous studies and studies since is that proprioception seems to be really integral. This plasticity appears to be integral to motor learning. Okay, so now that we have an idea how proprioception and prediction changes, and I'm talking about a higher order. Of course, I don't expect the muscle spindles and the tendons and the joints are changing. We're talking about how the brain is interpreting these signals and giving a proprioceptive estimate. But now we know how proprioception and prediction changes with learning. We want to see how these two processes may differ and how they may be influenced by other factors known to affect adaptation, such as cognitive strategy. Okay, so explicit learning augments implicit motor learning, but does it also affect proprioceptive and predictive changes? And so for these next set of studies, what we did was, again, we measured adaptation and changes in hand localization in several groups of participants, which differed in respect to a few things. Some got instruction, while others did not. Some adapted to a small rotation, that is a 30-degree rotation that I showed you in my previous study, as opposed to a larger rotation, which is double the size, so 60 degrees. And the nature of the feedback, we changed for two groups, which I'm going to explain when I describe the results. Okay, so again, I'm going to start by showing you the learning curves for these participants, as well as their reach after effects, those persistent deviations in the reach movement that occur after training. Okay, so the red is our non-instructor group, so they're performing pretty much like the group before. They take a while to learn, but they fully compensate after 90 trials and even earlier. And in our instructed group, they listened to us, so they did use our information we provided them and told them how to do it. And indeed, for those first couple of trials, they're doing much better at compensating because they're told what to do. Okay, but let's look at their reach after effects. So here on the left, I'm showing you trials where we told them to exclude whatever they were doing during training, whether we told them or whether they figured it out, because of course they compensated by the end of training. So we told them to exclude this. So this, we want to tap into that more implicit change that people can't really have cognitive control over, and they're going to produce nonetheless. And we had trials where they told them to include the strategy. So whatever they're doing here to replicate even in the absence of a cursor, so we can kind of gauge the extent by which they're actually using strategy, because anything that's produced in the include above what's shown in the exclude would reflect that strategy. So here are the results. So over here on the left is the reach after effects. They're about 15 degrees, which is typical for these kind of adaptation trials. And they're the same whether they're instructed or not. So they can't exclude this. They're told to, but they really do continue to produce that deviation, which again suggests they're largely unconscious or implicit. But when we're asked to include the strategy, those who got instruction were able to do it, but those who didn't for the small rotation were not able to. Okay, so we have one more condition. Oh, we have a couple more conditions. The next condition, we actually manipulated the nature of the feedback. And we call it the cursor jump, because when people were asked to move forward towards the target, what happened was the cursor first is aligned with the hand, but then actually jumps and then deviates 30 degrees clockwise in this case, okay? And so in each and every trial, they see the cursor jump, so of course they should be at least quite aware, especially after the first couple of trials, that something's going on that they have to compensate for, and indeed they compensate nicely for it. And nonetheless, they still have this persistent reach after effect, even when told not to bother, assume just move your head straight to the target. And of course, when they're asked to, move as if they were compensating for the cursor jump, they're able to include this strategy. Okay, so in our next two groups, they adapted to this larger rotation, one that was 60 degrees. And so we should see them compensating to a greater extent. Indeed, that's what we see in this blue group. The dark blue, they got the instruction, so they show a huge advantage right at the very beginning. Our non-instructed group, it takes a while to figure out what's going on and compensate for this perturbation. But indeed, by the end of the training, they're all compensating quite well for this distortion. But let's see what the reach after effects look like. And again, we see reach after effects that are this unconscious part where they still exclude, that are about 15 degrees. In fact, on the same time we were doing this study, another paper came out that suggests that indeed these implicit unconscious changes in reaches tend to be capped at 15 degrees independent of the size of the rotation. So long as the rotation is at least 20 degrees, and even if it's as large as 90, people produce these kind of changes in estimate, persistent reach deviations of about 15 degrees. And again, of course, our 60-degree group are also able to include the strategy, not only the instructed group, that's not surprising given that they also did for the 30 group, but even the non-instructed 60-degree group were able to figure out what they were doing at this stage and able to reproduce it even in the absence of a cursor. Okay, and we have one more group. Okay, this is just remind me that indeed they all have reach after effects. We have one more group because we were thinking, well, I have where reach after effects are not elicited. But what happens if they could see their hand, right? And all these other times, all these other trials, they can't see their hand. They only see the cursor during training. But what if we actually just let them see the hand? Usually we cover the hand with a little tinted surface, so which we project the cursor on, and we make it dark so they can't see the hand. Well, for this task, we lit up the hand so they're able to see their hand at the same time as they saw the target, at the same time they saw the cursor, which they had to move the cursor to the target. So in some ways, they should clearly see the dissociation in each and every trial. And they adapt to it. People are able to adapt to many things. When we look at the reach after effects, you can see here that even in the hand view, it's much smaller, but they show a significant reach after effect. So they even show some persistent deviation in the reaches in this condition, although it's far smaller. And it's the only condition I know where they show such a reduction in the reach after effects. And of course, they were able to include the stretch when asked. So for all these groups, except for the people who weren't instructed and got a small rotation, and they can't even elicit any additional deviation when told to use a strategy, all the other groups had various amounts of conscious, or at least they were aware of the manipulation and were able to produce it when asked. Okay, so this is interesting. How does this affect their estimate of hand position? Okay, so let me just remind you again, we're using the same two tasks I just described earlier, where we have people either move their unseen hand outward, and then we ask them to estimate the location of hand, and this should be based on prediction and proprioception. And then we have those passive trials that follow, where we move the robot to those same locations, and because they're being dragged out, they should only reflect, at least largely, proprioception. Okay, so I'm going to show you the results here for the passive localization. That should be only the proprioception, and the active localization, which should reflect both prediction and proprioception. And here we can see the results of the non-instructed group for 30 degrees rotation, which is similar to what I showed in our first study. So they did about 6 degrees shift in this estimate relative to baseline, which we collected prior to training for the passive localization, and it was a little bit larger when they also were able to generate that movement and therefore had predictive estimates as well. Okay, but we saw this also in the instructed group. So even when they're aware or telling them exactly what the cursor is doing, they still misestimate. They recalibrate their sense of hand position and even update their predictions. Even in the 60-degree group, we see this shift in their estimate of hand position. It's about the same size. So even though the distortion is twice as large, the amount by which they misestimate their hand is about the same. That may be similar to the reach after effects. Maybe there's some type of saturation point by which these more implicit or unconscious changes are changing, but no further. But we do see it increases a bit more for the active localization. This is when the group was instructed. Looks like it's a little bit smaller, but not significantly so. And this is for the cursor jump, right? The cursor jump, which keeps moving every single trial. Even these folks are misestimating their hand closer to where they visually see the hand when acquiring the target. So how about that last condition, the one where they actually see their hand at the same time as the cursor? So there's no ambiguity. It's clearly the cursor that's deviated and not deviated relative to the hand. And nonetheless, this group also misperceives their hand position. They and by the same amount as the other conditions. It's again for a 30-degree rotation. Although the shift that they show in the active localization is actually not much larger. In fact, when I show you the difference over here between active and passive, which is supposed to be kind of a way to kind of isolate predicted consequences. We see that at least in this group, there's not the active shift or the active localization was not larger. Okay, so let me just summarize this study before I go and talk about one other factor that we looked at. So for visuomotor adaptation, cognitively accessible strategies are listed by instruction, large rotations, and showing manipulations, the jumping cursor, or the showing the view of the hand. And these proprioceptive estimates of hand movement still shift with adaptation, regardless of knowledge, even in the face when they can see that, or those predicted updating seems to at least be smaller or non-existent when it's clear what the source of error is. That is when they actually see their hand as well. Okay, so we also, another factor that's supposed to, at least some studies have shown that also affect adaptation is aging. Okay, so with age, sensory acuity as well as cognitive capacity decreases, and some studies also show that they show that older adults, those over the age of 60, don't learn to the same extent as younger adults. So we wanted to test that as well. That is, we want to know whether age affected motor learning or strategy use in our paradigm using only the 30-degree rotation. And in our paper, in our study, we found no difference. So our older adults that are 60 years old and older, they're about at least 20 per group, we found no difference in their learning rate. However, we also had a group who was instructed, and I'm not showing you the results, I'm just going to describe them because wasn't our main question, but we did find that older adults benefited from instructions when we gave them at the beginning of the task, but not as much as younger adults. So they benefited, but not to the same extent. So that's a little bit consistent with a previous studies that suggest that they don't use strategy use, or at least when given instructions, they don't use it to the same extent, although they did show the same pattern of exclude, include, the no cursors as the younger adults. And we didn't find any difference for the non-instructed groups between older and younger. And again, it might be just smaller rotations. Usually older adults have no problem. But our main question was really does age affect the learning-induced changes in hand localization? So I'm going back to that plot, and now I'm going to fill in that gap. Okay, I'm going to show you the results of our older adults, so over the age of 60, when they're adapting to a 30-degree rotation, either non-instructed or instructed. And this is what we found. We found they actually show a larger change in their, a larger shift in their estimate of passive hand localization. In fact, we see a similar shift in active localization. It's not that much larger. In fact, when we see the difference, it's only minimally larger. But maybe it might be that this huge shift or misperception of where the hand actually went, maybe it's at the saturation point, so that any further changes that might be produced because of this updated prediction is not detectable. Okay, so instruction doesn't help older people as much as an initial training, and older adults recalibrate proprioception to a larger degree. Okay, but why? Why is it that older adults are recalibrating proprioception to a large degree? So probably one of the main reasons that we came up with, I'm sure you've probably thought the same thing, is perhaps like vision and audition, as we age, proprioception also becomes noisier and less reliable with age. Well, we can look at that in our own results, because as I mentioned, we also measure these estimates of hand localization prior to training, and we have a number of trials. So we have a good number of trials, so we can get a very reliable measure of variance. So what I'm going to show you is the variance by which people estimate the location of their hand. Let me just say, I'm not going to show you the actual accuracy. They're equally accurate, older and younger adults. But given that we're interested in this idea of noise, I'm showing you the variance. And that shows here. So this is the variance for the active estimate of hand, so estimate of hand position in the active displacement of the hand, and estimate the variance of the estimates on the hand when the robot dragged the hand out. And notice, and so this is a frequency distribution. It's actually a density plot, because of course we have a lot more younger people. This is across all our different conditions or different experiments, and only 40 older adults. Nonetheless, you can see where the peak, the older adults in the blue are actually more precise. They're less variable than younger adults. And of course, that has to do probably with motivation, right? We invite these older adults to participate. They come all the way to the lab to participate. We give them a little stipend or gift card to thank them. We feed them. And so they're really very highly motivated to do well for us, where our younger adults tend to be from a participant pool where they're getting course credit. So maybe they're not so keen about being as precise as they could be. So that kind of explains it. But obviously, clearly, older adults are not suffering from a noisier estimate of proprioception. And I think that makes sense. So many of the studies that suggest that older adults might be poor proprioception is based on matching, hand angle or reproducing hand movements, which is not something we're particularly good at or do much of. What we're really good at, and we get lots of experience on, is precisely controlling our hand movements. So indeed, maybe if when asked to actually estimate the actual hand location, people are pretty precise no matter what age. Okay. So, so my next set of studies also looking at these two variables. We're asking a slightly different question. We want to know the time course. When do these changes in hand estimates and these reach after effects, when do they emerge? Because in these previous studies from my lab and others, we usually make, train people, have them do, 60, 90, hundreds of trials before we measure reach after effects and these changes in hand position, especially reach after effects, which is a very common measure in many of these paradigms, but only would be measured after at least 100 trials. But of course, so we had no idea how quickly they would emerge. So we began back in 2016 with a fairly simple task, which we began. They adapted to a 30-degree rotation, and we began with 6 training trials. So we had 2 groups, and they all began with 6 training trials. And then we asked them to reach without cursor for 3 trials, then go back and do another 6 training trials. And then this group did 3 trials where they were asked to localize their hand after it was passively moved. And the other group did the same thing. They also started with reach training, but this time they did the hand localization first, then reach training, no cursor, and they oscillated between the 2. So technically, we have estimates of either reach after effects or changes in hand estimates after every set of 6 trials. And I'm going to show you the results here. In the green are the reach after effects. In the pink, the hand localization. You can see the hand localization is about 6 degrees and the reach after effects about 15, like we've seen in previous studies in my lab and others. But notice how fast it is. We were surprised. So here we see the change in hand estimate right after the first 6 training trials is almost near saturation. We don't see, in fact, it doesn't get too much larger with these additional trials, which means we've been torturing people for hours when we didn't need to, because we could have seen these changes much earlier. Even the reach after effects are coming in much earlier than would have been assumed to be the case, given that all of us usually have people train much longer before they remeasure this. But this just got us more excited. We were thinking, okay, well, exactly how quickly do these things emerge? So we just did another experiment where we sampled this even more finely. So this time we had to have different groups of participants, because what we're going to do is we recorded either hand localization or no cursor reaches after every single reach training trial. So they move with a cursor with the perturbation of 30 degrees. And after every one of those trials, we either have them do a no cursor reach or we have them do a hand localization trial. So we can really measure this on a trial by trial basis. And so what we want to know is, how does the time course of these changes relate to that of reach adaptation? And so here we actually relied on a space state model, or a 2-rate model that was developed by Maurice Smith in 2016 to help explain the time course of force field adaptation, which is another type of adaptation of the reaching movements in response to some changes in dynamics or mechanical perturbations. They also did the same thing for saccade adaptation. And their model involves a fast process that adapts and decays quickly, and a slow process that adapts and decays more gradually. And since that paper, others have also shown that the state space model can also explain visuomotor adaptation. And these papers even suggested that the slow process may really be reflecting that more unconscious change that we're seeing, like for the reach after effects and so forth. So we thought, wow, this might be a good way of trying to model these more unconscious implicit changes, such as reach after effects and these changes in hand estimates. So we wanted to know whether changes in hand proprioception and reach after effects are similar to one of these processes. Okay, so here is a the perturbation schedule, how we deviated the cursor. And we do it this way in order to tease apart, just like Marie Smith did, to tease apart this fast and slow process. So we always begin, and that's true for all of my experiments, I don't always mention it, but of course we begin with a baseline condition where the cursor is aligned with the reaches. And again, every second reach, we're measuring either hand localization or no cursor reach. And then at trial 64, we introduce a 30-degree rotation here for about 180 trials. And then we do a short reversal of the cursor direction. This is to really pull apart the fast and slow process so we can distinguish the two. And then this is followed by a visual clamp phase where the cursor always goes directly to the target, independent of where the hand moves. And so technically this should produce a type of a rebound or some type of retention due to the fact that only the slow process should be contributing to this last change. But again, our main question is really how does this affect these extra trials? But let me first show you what the reach training looked like. So this is our adaptation rates. This is reach data with a cursor, and indeed people adapt quite well. We can fit the model, find the fast process, find the slow process. But again, what we want to know is what do changes in the estimate of hand position look like. So I'm going to show you that next. Again, these are the trials that are happening every second trial. So these are the reach training trials. I'm going to now show you the intervening trials where they're estimating the location of their passively displaced hand. And here it is. So again, 60 degrees, but it's immediate. We're saying within one trial, they're hitting saturation. We were shocked. We were surprised. That obviously does not look like the fast process as fast as it is, but it doesn't, and it definitely doesn't look like the slow process. And when we tested another 32 participants, this time we had them actively generate the movement and then estimate their hand location. Of course, they're fast as well because this is largely reflecting that change in proprioception, maybe with a little bit more going on. And so again, they don't match any model. The only thing we could see that it could explain this is this change is proportional to the size of the perturbation, period. That's this discrepancy between vision and proprioception. Of course, we had a third group, right, who did those no cursor reaches. So this is their reach training. So these are their reaches with the cursor, of course, because we have to fit the model. And then we have to, and for the model, we get the fast and slow process. And here I'm going to show you the no cursor reaches in dark green. Hello. Sometimes I omit people and then I lose control. Okay, here it is. And so these are the no cursor reaches. And you can see they're, again, 15 degrees. They're 15 degrees saturation, as I showed before. But they're emerging really quickly, much faster than expected, and particularly fast in this study. We just happened to, for these 32 participants, that they were fast, but indeed much faster than would have been assumed by people in the field or can be considered be the case for these slow and fast processes. Okay, so just one more study we did on this. We were wondering, at least I was wondering, how robust is this change? How can we slow it down or reduce it at all? So we did an additional study, which we started before the pandemic. We were going to do more, but we weren't able to. But I got some results that should be some interesting. So we repeated the same paradigm for measuring passive hand localization, again, every second trial. But this time we changed the training paradigm so that people only got feedback of their hand. They only saw the cursor at the end of the movement. It's sometimes called terminal feedback or endpoint feedback, or sometimes knowledge of results. So instead of having the cursor move with the hidden hand, in this case, when they move their hand out, the cursor only pops in at the end when the reaching movement is complete. Okay, so we have people do this, and again, every second trial, we're measuring their estimate of hand position. And we also had another group of 32 who did this, what we call exposure training. Sometimes we call it passive training. It's a paradigm we developed over a decade ago, where we actually have the robot drag the hand out along with the cursor. So the cursor goes directly to the target, but the hand is dragged 30 degrees more in one direction, right? So we have the same visual proprioceptive discrepancy here, but this time there's no movement being generated. People just are asked to kind of relax and let their hand be pulled away. But we can still measure their estimate of hand position every second trial. Okay, so here is the results I already showed you for the passive localization group in our previous study, right? So now we call them the continuous group because they got the continuous feedback and they're actually making these active, normal classical reachings. And these are the proprioceptive changes, okay? And here it is for the terminal feedback in red. So it slowed down a bit by 3 trials. So having less visual feedback not only at the end of the reach, it did reduce the change or how quickly it changed. It didn't change the overall, the size is about the same. So they saturate by the same amount, but it's a little bit slower. And for the exposure, they were super fast. So within a single trial. I'll show you the exponential fits to this for the time course in a bit. Okay, just to complete this, let me just say that indeed sometimes some papers have shown, some studies have shown that when adapting to terminal feedback, people are a little bit slower or they don't learn quite as much when training with a terminal feedback. And indeed, we did find that our group was a little bit slower at reaching saturation during training. So maybe that explains why they're slightly slower at shifting their hand, shifting their estimate of hand position. Okay, but let me show you what this rate of change looks like, because most studies that look at, usually they don't really look at the rate of change. What they do is they take the average of the first block of trials, and usually the block of trials can be anywhere from 3 to 8 trials. So that, makes it hard to really see these really rapid changes that we're finding. So what we do is we did an exponential fit, and I'm doing it as a percent of saturation because of course they saturate at different levels, right? Reaches should go all the way to 30 degrees. Our changes in hand estimate are about 6 degrees, and for a reach after effect, this should be about 15. So we do it with respect to saturation. Here I'm going to show you the reach training for the classical condition where they're constantly seeing they see the cursor the entire time, and you can see, and these are only to forward targets. Sometimes they have a larger target set that's radial. Indeed, they're a little bit faster when they have only forward targets, and they only take about 10 to 12 trials to reach saturation. And how quickly the change in proprioception recalibration is let me show you the slow process. Sorry. Remember, we fitted the data with the slow and fast process. I'm only showing you the slow process just to give you an idea, because this was our original hypothesis, how we thought, changes in proprioception or reach after effects might look like. Okay, here is the change in hand estimate during the passive localization. And you can see, although there's some variability, indeed, some people might have taken 5 trials before they hit saturation. The great majority took only 1, okay? And in the active localization, we had, again, only within a single trial, right? Sorry, look at the x-axis here. You're looking at the first 20 trials, because this is happening so fast that it doesn't make sense to have anything to have the complete 180. Okay, so this is, and here I'm showing you the changes in passive hand localization when training with a terminal cursor. You can see it takes a little longer. It takes 3 trials, and some people take as many as 5 trials to saturate. Okay, and here I'm going to show exposure, again, super immediate. And the last one, the reach after effect. So reach after effects are shown here in the green. And again, it's taking only 3 trials to saturate. Again, this is a little bit on the fast side. We have paradigms where it takes a little bit longer, but indeed, it can be super fast like this, where they're saturating at that 15-degree mark, which is found by all other papers, but within 3 trials. So to summarize, changes in estimates of hand location happens very quickly across different manipulations, and changes in no cursors can also occur quite quickly, and neither match the model processes. Okay, so I have 2 more little studies to talk about before I wrap up. One is also related to visuomotor adaptation, and then one's a little bit off topic outside my abstract, but I can hopefully do it in quickly. Okay, now I'm interested in visuomotor adaptation, but I have to admit, it's not very often that we have to adapt to visual or even mechanical changes of our body, right? I mean, we do grow, so we do have to adapt to changes in our length. And, we can get injured, and we can be wearing gear that changes where we see our hands or how we mechanically move them. But usually when we adapt, it's because we're adapting to our ever-changing environments. It's because we use objects and tools, and these tools and objects have different properties. So my next research program, which we began before the lockdown, and which has been halted, but we started again, I'm just going to show you some preliminary data just to give you kind of an idea of where we're going with these questions, where we're looking at how the motor system learns the properties of objects, tools, and the environment. So in this task, we didn't want to go too far from what we've been doing, where people just have to pick up an object and move it to a vessel of the same shape. And what we're going to do is they're going to actually see their hand when they pick it up, but then the hand disappears. It's transparent, so you can see it, but the participant didn't see it. And at this point, we're going to deviate the direction by which the object is transported. Okay, and you can see that even in this illustration, that people are able to quickly adapt. At least in my research, my PhD student was able to in this demonstration. Okay, so in this task, participants pick up an object to put on a target vessel, and they do so. They're trained to do it with their dominant right hand. And our main question, just to keep this really short, was really whether what they learned in this task, whether it was attributed to the object, and if so, would we see transferred to the opposite hand? So, the analogy is like if you had to throw a dart that's somehow defective. The dart's a little bit defective, so you have to figure out how you have to throw the dart in order to get it to the bullseye. Well, once you figure this out, you've thrown the dart quite a few times with your dominant hand, let's say, and you then change hands, technically the dart is still defective, so whatever you've learned to do with your right hand, hopefully it transfers to left hand. You learn something about the object property, and you hopefully are going to use that no matter what arm you're using. So that's where we're hoping. So let me just show you that people were able to adapt to this deviation in the movement of the object. They compensate. It's a 30-degree perturbation, and they compensate. But our main measure here is that we had some trials that are kind of like after effects. We visually clamp it. So we always had to have the object. We couldn't get the object out because, of course, that would change the task completely. But what happened was the object moved directly toward the vessel, no matter where the hand moved. It moved, of course, the amplitude moved with the hand, but it moved always directly to the vessel. So they're visually clamped in that case. And this is how people did in the trained hand. But again, the question here is what happens with the untrained hand. And indeed, we see some the opposite hand and seen some of the properties they learned about this object when they were training with a trained hand did transfer to the opposite hand, although not as much as we would expect if it was purely that they were learning the properties of the object. And it could be that we just have to design, and we have designed better, hopefully more useful, more illuminating experiments that kind of hopefully look at this more often. Okay, so I'm going to summarize, before I talk about my last little part, let me summarize this main talk, which is really what the abstract was about. So visual adaptation leads to both perceived and predicted changes in hand estimates. Explicit learning does not seem to affect either type of estimates. This visually driven changes in hand proprioception, but not prediction, increases somewhat with age, and reach after effect and changes in estimate of hand position emerge quickly and distinct from slow and fast learning. Okay, so okay, so I'm going to do my last little research program that we were doing during lockdown, because we could do it during lockdown, and it's actually looking at the effect of cannabis use on cognitive and motor function. And actually, this is a project that we proposed and even got some funding to do prior to lockdown, but we had to carry it out during lockdown. And of course, it's inspired by the fact that in 2018, recreational cannabis use was legalized in Canada. Yay, way to go, Canada. But of course, we're not too sure how cannabis use really affects the cognitive and motor, processes that would underlie DLA function. So in 2020, we established a browser, we began a browser study using a battery of established tasks. So tasks that have been well tested in the laboratory and in some cases online too. So we've created these, we replicated these experiments for online format. And I'm going to show you the results of 3 of them as a function of cannabis use. And of course, we're testing university students, so highly functioning people. And we're mainly, especially for the purpose of this talk, we're looking at frequency of use. Okay, although we asked about cannabis onset, the type of cannabis and why they're taking it. But for this little short review of this, we compared performance of frequent users, which were mainly people who used it daily or a few times a week, with infrequent users who use about once a month, maybe a few times a month, or at least once in the last couple of months, with non-users, people who've never used. Okay. And here's the results for one task. We call it, it's a visual search task, which measures selective attention, where they're asked to, indicate whether an upright T is within this array. So they press a button as soon as they see the T, and they press a button if they don't, another button if they do not see the T. So sometimes the T is absent. And it's among distractors, and we increase the number of distractors. Again, this is a classical paradigm, and I'm going to show you the classical result. So the classical result is that as set size increases, the reaction time for detecting that T or detecting that's absent increases, and it takes longer to detect when it's absent compared to when it's present. So this is exactly the pattern people see when they are rigorously tested within laboratory settings. But of course, our main point is that it doesn't differ across our three groups. Whether you're a frequent user or non-user or infrequent user, people are performing pretty much the same. We had another task that was supposed to measure working memory. It's called the NBAC task. So in that case, in every trial, they see one of these 9 squares light up, and they have to say whether this location is the same as the square that lit up in the previous trial, the 1 back, or 2 trials ago, the 2 back, or 3 trials ago in the 3 back. So you can imagine it gets harder for every time you go back, and that's indeed what is the case. Sensitivity or accuracy becomes poorer for more as you have to use your working memory farther back. But again, the main point here is that it didn't differ across the 3 sets of users. And the last task I'm going to talk about, it's a no-go task. It looks at response inhibition or impulsivity. And people had to hit a button every time they saw a go signal, but they were told not to hit the button when they saw a no-go. So they were shown a no-go that happened less frequently, 20% of the time, and they're not supposed to respond. And again, we can look at the accuracy by which you're able to respond and suppress the other response, and it doesn't differ across the 3 groups. Okay, so in summary, so this last, we found that frequent users perform similar to non-frequent users and in all 8 tasks. I only show you 3, but currently we're investigating the immediate effect of being high on the same performance measures. So what we do is we invite our frequent users to do the battery again. This time we get them on Zoom so we can see them take their hit, their usual dose. So we don't supply the cannabis, so their own supply. They get high in front of one of my research assistants or my 2 master students who are in charge of this project. And once they're sufficiently high, we ask them to start the battery, which we don't, the researchers don't look at. They can perform it, but they're monitored just to make sure that everything is okay. And really the goal is to use this battery of tasks to create a large database to model and possibly identify causal relations between demographics and lifestyle factors, cannabis use being just one of many. It could be also multilingualism, history of concussion, history of dementia, from familial dementia, and so forth, and cognitive motor function in a large cross-section of the population. So that's our goal for the feature. And of course, I would like to recognize all the members of my lab who contributed to this and related work, including a few of my alumni who have since left my lab, but whose results I've talked about today.